I never expected her to remember my name, let alone everything else. It was past 10 when I finally peeled myself off the couch, a half-empty mug in my hand and the glow of my phone on my lap. Saturday nights were always like this. Half-watched shows, long pauses between texts I never sent. The apartment felt too quiet, like it was waiting for something I couldn't name. I'd stopped at the corner cafe on the way back, the one with the mismatched chairs and the faint smell of burnt espresso. She was there, of course, because she always was when I came in, not exactly waiting for me, just there, ordering her usual, a chai latte with extra cinnamon. "Hey," she said, just that. And I realized my heart had jumped in that moment, for no reason at all. "Hey," I muttered, fumbling my wallet. I think I smiled, but I couldn't tell. My eyes had already found hers. She had this way of tilting her head just slightly when she listened, like she was carefully considering whether I was worth her attention. "You still get the cold brew?" she asked, and I nodded before I could think about it. She smiled, the one that makes you want to say something clever but leaves you tongue-tied instead. I didn't say anything, just folded the napkin she handed me across the counter, my fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second, then recoiling, pretending nothing happened. I watched her as she left, the way her coat brushed her knees, the subtle flick of her eyes toward the tip of her boots. Tiny details, I know, but they made my chest tight for reasons I wasn't ready to name. She waved at someone behind me, probably a barista she knew, but for a second it felt like she'd waved at me. Back at my apartment, I tried to shake it off. Coffee cooling in a mug, half-sent messages lingering in my drafts. I stared at the ceiling, thinking about the way she laughed at a joke I didn't make, but felt like it was directed at me anyway. Silence stretched longer than it should, a ticking clock punctuating everything I didn't say. I thought about texting her just to ask something trivial about the book she was reading at the cafe, but I didn't. Fingers hovered over the keys, then retreated. I didn't know if it was fear or just habit, leaving things unfinished. There's a knock at my door, soft and hesitant. My heart skips, and I think about who it could be. Delivery, a neighbor, my roommate. But when I open it, there she is, mid-40s, still in that coat that somehow makes her look effortless, her bag slung casually over her shoulder. She shifts her weight from one foot to the other, hands hidden in the pockets. "Hi," she says, and I notice the pause before she adds, I was in the neighborhood." Her eyes flick to the floor, then back up at me. There's a tension in her voice that doesn't match the casual words, like she's waiting for permission to cross some invisible line. "Hey," I say again, louder this time, more real. My hand itches to close the door, to keep things normal, but I can't. "Not yet." She smiles, not fully, just the corners of her mouth, and I realize how much I've missed these small gestures. How the ordinary can feel heavy with unspoken meaning. I step aside, and she shifts like she's considering whether to come in or not. I want to ask why she's here, what brought her, but the words stick in my throat. So I just stand there, aware of my own silence, aware of how loud it feels in the quiet of my apartment. She tilts her head again, and I feel something I can't define. Curiosity, anticipation, both. "Mind if I come in?" she asks finally, and the question hangs between us, unfinished, waiting. I step aside, heart thudding, and let her decide. Here's prompt 2 fully realized. 500 words, building tension, deepening connection, Kitako style. She stepped inside slowly, her coat brushing the edge of the coffee table. I lingered near the door, half expecting her to turn around, half hoping she wouldn't. "Thanks," she said, shrugging off the coat and setting it on the back of a chair. Her bag thumped softly on the floor. "I didn't mean to just drop by." No, it's fine," I said, fumbling with the mug still in my hand. I sat down on the couch, leaving space between us, though part of me wanted to move closer. She perched on the arm of the couch, careful, like she wasn't supposed to be here. For a few minutes, we just sat, neither of us talking. The ticking clock on the wall sounded too loud. "I haven't been here in a while," she finally said, breaking the silence. Her voice was casual, but something behind it tugged at me. "I used to come by when—" She hesitated, glancing at me, then smiled faintly. "When my son would be at your friend's place. You were always around." I nodded, heart stuttering. "Yeah, I guess we ran into each other a few times. My voice sounded smaller than I expected. She laughed quietly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. I remember your careful way of making tea, not spilling a drop, even when the mug was too full. Her gaze lingered for a moment, scanning my apartment like she could see the person I tried to hide. I blinked, surprised that she remembered. I just like things not messy. Stupid words. But she smiled anyway, and I felt a shift. We moved toward the kitchen, almost without thinking, and she poured us each a cup. Steam curled up, warm against the cold tension of the room. We sat at the counter, side by side, neither touching, but the silence between us felt heavier than words. You still see him often? I asked finally, thinking of her son, trying to ground myself. Not as much. He's busy with college now, she said, eyes distant. Then, softer, divorced. Life gets complicated. I nodded, swallowing. There it was, the invisible line I shouldn't cross. The reminder that some things were off limits. But the weight of her presence made it hard to care about the rules. I imagined the what-ifs, her leaning closer, brushing a hand against mine, a laugh shared over a shared memory. My chest tightened, my mind filling with possibilities I couldn't voice. She handed me a sugar packet. I fumbled to open, and our fingers brushed. My hand froze mid-motion, and I caught her glance. Not teasing, not fleeting, just noticing me. I don't know why that moment stayed with me. I thought, watching her stir her tea, maybe because it felt like someone finally saw me. She smiled softly, almost shyly, and for a second, I wanted to reach out to close that small distance. Instead, I let my fingers linger on the counter, brushing against hers again, a subtle, silent connection. A pause, a small shared smile, a breath that stretched too long. She didn't say anything, but the gesture, just letting our hands almost meet, spoke more than words ever could. And in that quiet, half-lit kitchen, with tea steaming between us and the world outside pressing in, I realized how fragile and real it all felt. Here's prompt 3 fully executed. 500 words, Kitako style, emotional tension rising, near confession included. The next few days blurred into quiet routines. I kept thinking about her more than I wanted to admit. How her laugh lingered in my apartment. How her coat smelled faintly of something warm, cinnamon maybe, that made the air feel different. She stopped by again on Thursday, just as rain started pattering against the windows. I was sitting at my desk, half-finished sketch in front of me, headphones on, trying not to hope. But when she knocked, my chest tightened before I even opened the door. "Hey," she said, voice softer this time. She wrung her hands together, eyes flicking to the floor. "Thought I'd drop something off. Forgot it last week." I stepped aside. "Sure. Cool mean." She set a small envelope on the counter. I picked it up, fingers brushing hers briefly, and she pulled back immediately, like the brush of skin had startled her. I noticed. We sat on the couch, rain tapping on the window, steam curling from the mugs she insisted we drink. There was a pause, long, comfortable, and unbearable at the same time. I wanted to say something. Anything. You didn't have to come. I muttered finally, eyes tracing the faint freckles on her hand as she wrapped both around her mug. "I know," she said, a flicker of a smile. "But I wanted to." Her words hung in the air, incomplete. I sensed the hesitation behind them, the invisible boundary she wasn't ready to cross. I leaned back, trying to hide the pull I felt toward her. My mind raced through everything I shouldn't imagine. The tilt of her head, the way her lips would curve when she laughed, the warmth that seemed to fill the room when she just existed there. A sudden noise, my phone buzzing, broke the moment. My roommate's text, stupid and banal, but it reminded me how ordinary life kept intruding. She glanced at it, then back at me, and I noticed the way her fingers tightened on the mug, a subtle retreat, almost imperceptible. I tried to focus on something else, trace the edge of the envelope she'd left. She reached over, almost brushing my hand again. I froze. The air between us was electric, a quiet gravity pulling us closer, and yet she shifted back slightly. Not gone, just careful. I started, but the words faltered. She looked at me, lips parted like she might say something too, and my heart thudded. We sat there, rain tapping, fingers almost touching, and I realized we were teetering on the edge of something that could never be named aloud. Not yet. Not here. I imagined leaning in, letting the quiet spill into the space between us. Her gaze lingered on mine, soft, questioning, a little unsure, but daring me anyway. And then a pause. A breath. She smiled faintly, almost shyly, and that smile stopped me. Stopped everything. We didn't move closer. Didn't speak. But the near kiss, the almost connection, was a promise neither of us could claim. And when she finally stood to leave, coat back on, bag in hand, I caught the flicker in her eyes. Hesitation. Interest. Fear. Everything all at once. She turned the knob, paused, looked back at me, and in that one heartbeat, I felt the weight of what we weren't yet ready to do. The door clicked softly behind her, and I sat there, hand frozen on the counter, thinking about how close we had been, so close, and how painfully ordinary the rain outside sounded. Here's prompt 4 fully realized, 500 words Kutako style, emotional tension peaking, right before climax. It was late afternoon when I ran into her again, just outside the corner bookstore, the one she liked for its narrow aisles and faint smell of old paper. Rain had stopped, but the pavement still glistened. She leaned against the brick wall, hands tucked in the pockets of her coat, scrolling through her phone. "Hey," I said, voice quieter than usual. "Hey," she replied, eyes lifting slowly. Something in her gaze flickered, hesitation, maybe something sharper like worry. We walked together toward the small park bench near the fountain. Silence settled between us, heavier than the drizzle that had fallen earlier. "I saw him today," she said suddenly, almost dropping the words, almost like she'd meant to say them elsewhere. Your friend's son." Her fingers fiddled with the zipper of her coat. I noticed the way her eyes avoided mine, the subtle tightness in her jaw. "Oh," I said, keeping my voice calm, even though my chest tightened. "Yeah," she continued. "He mentioned you. Funny, isn't it?" She laughed softly, but it didn't reach her eyes. I don't know, ridiculous. I keep thinking about you." The confession hung between us, raw and tentative, like a candle flickering in the wind. My hand itched to reach for hers, but I stayed still, aware that this was fragile, exposed. We sat on the bench, not touching, just close enough that our shoulders almost brushed. The fountain gurgled quietly in the background. I watched the way her eyes drifted over the park, lingering on nothing. "I shouldn't feel like this," she said after a pause, voice softer now, almost a whisper. "It's wrong. I know it. But I can't." Her sentence trailed off. I wanted to tell her that I felt the same, that every time she was near I was undone, that I imagined things I shouldn't. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned back slightly, letting the quiet stretch. Let her choose the words she needed without me interrupting. Her fingers brushed a stray leaf on the bench, then mine. A fleeting, unintentional touch, but it jolted me. I caught her gaze, soft, searching, unsure. I wanted to hold her hand, to keep it there, but I didn't. My chest felt full in a way I hadn't expected. "I can't stop thinking," she said finally, words spilling out, more than she probably meant to. She paused, swallowed, about what it would be like if things were different. The world around us felt suspended. Children's laughter drifted from a nearby playground. A dog barked somewhere behind the trees. Everything was ordinary, mundane, and yet our own small universe felt electric with unspoken truth. I wanted to reach out. I wanted to close the distance. But I held back, letting her words hang, letting the tension stretch into infinity. She shifted on the bench, coat brushing mine ever so slightly, and her eyes flicked to mine. That small look, question, fear, longing, all at once made my stomach twist. Should I?" she whispered, barely audible, as if asking herself rather than me. And I froze, because that question, unspoken, unfinished, was everything. Everything I wanted to answer, everything I wanted to do. But we both knew the answer could break something fragile, or change everything irreversibly. Here's prompt 5, fully realized, 500 words Kutako style, introducing twist and ambiguity. The following week was strange. I kept expecting her to show up, to slip back into our quiet routines like the rain never stopped and the park bench was still ours. But she didn't. I went to the cafe she liked, hoping to catch her laughing over a chai latte, but only strangers occupied the mismatched chairs. I ordered my usual cold brew, stirred it slowly, and realized I'd been imagining her everywhere. Then my phone buzzed with a message I almost didn't recognize. It wasn't hers. It was a mutual friend's, offhand, casual, "She's busy this week." Family stuff. Family stuff. The words rolled around in my head. My chest tightened, but not in pain exactly. More like a hollow echo, the kind you notice when silence stretches too long. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. I went for walks near the bookstore, traced the edges of the park bench with my fingers as if she might suddenly appear, a coat brushing the pavement, her eyes lifting toward mine. Nothing. I found myself replaying her last words over and over. I can't stop thinking about what it would be like if things were different. But now, in the quiet of my apartment, they felt like a ghost. A window slightly ajar that someone had closed before I could step through. I imagined all sorts of reasons for her absence. Maybe she'd remembered the rules, sun, age, life. Maybe she decided it was easier to stop coming. Maybe someone else was waiting for her. My own habits changed. I left texts unsent, messages typed and deleted, draft after draft piling up like unread letters. I avoided the cafe, the park bench, even the corner of the street where we first ran into each other. My apartment felt too empty, but stepping outside felt like trespassing into someone else's life. And then, one evening, my phone vibrated. I froze, heart in my throat, thinking maybe it was her. But it was nothing. A notification for a sale. A friend checking in. Not her. I sat on the couch, mug in hand, tracing the rim with a fingertip. 1,000 what-ifs spun around, each one heavier than the last. What if I'd leaned in? What if I'd said something? What if she never comes back? But the truth was, I didn't feel heartbroken. Not exactly. I felt paused, suspended, like life forgot to finish the sentence, leaving me waiting in the middle of a story that might never continue. I glanced at the park bench outside my window, empty, slick with rain that had started again. The streets glimmered with reflections, strangers walking past, none of them noticing the tension of a story that had paused mid-breath. I typed her name into my phone, thumb hovering over the call button. I didn't press it. I left the door unlocked in case she came. I didn't knock. I stared at the mug, the steam curling like a question mark, and let the quiet stretch, letting her absence settle in. And in that silence, the world carried on around me. Unaware, ordinary, everything moving forward except us. Here's prompt 6, fully realized, 500 words, Kitako style, the quiet emotional climax. It was Saturday evening when she returned. The air was damp from earlier rain, the streetlights casting pale reflections on the pavement. I heard the soft knock before she said anything. My chest tightened, not from anticipation exactly, but from knowing that something needed to be decided. I opened the door. She stood there, coat still damp, bag in hand, looking hesitant. The briefest smile touched her lips, and I felt all the waiting, all the empty benches and unsent messages compress into one small, tense moment. "Hey," she said softly. "Hey," I replied. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. She stepped inside, taking off her coat slowly, like she wanted to pause, make sure the space between us felt safe. I didn't move, didn't know whether to reach for her hand or stay still. We ended up in the kitchen, the apartment quiet except for the faint hum of the fridge. She leaned against the counter, arms folded, eyes flicking toward mine and away again. I poured us both a cup of tea, steam curling up between us, fragile and temporary. "Look," she began, words catching. I wasn't sure. About everything. About me showing up. About what this, whatever this is, means. I nodded, letting the silence stretch before replying. I wasn't sure either. But I kept hoping. I guess. My hand trembled slightly as I set my mug down. She looked at me, then really looked, eyes tracing my face, memorizing small lines and angles, the faint tension in my shoulders. I didn't mean to make it confusing. I just didn't want to cross a line I couldn't come back from. The words were simple, almost mundane, but their weight pressed on both of us. I wanted to tell her everything. How long I'd imagined her, how her laughter had kept me company when no one else was around. But I didn't. I let the quiet carry it instead. We sipped tea, not touching, not speaking, and yet the tension between us shifted. No fireworks, no declarations, just an understanding that something had changed. That we had been seen, finally. I don't know what happens next, she said, almost whispering, fingers tracing the rim of her mug. But I wanted to be here. That's all. I set my mug down too and let my hand hover near hers, close enough to brush if she wanted. She glanced down, then up, and the faintest smile, real, human, spread across her face. Okay, I said quietly. No embellishment, no promises, just acknowledgement. She nodded, and we let that small gesture hold us in place. Not a beginning, not an ending, just presence, shared space, something that had been waiting for a long time. I realized then that vulnerability didn't need grand statements, that the cost of honesty was measured in quiet moments, in the choice to stay, to risk, to simply exist with someone else in the same room. She reached for the mug again, and our fingers brushed. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just tangible. Enough. And I thought, maybe that's enough. For now. Here's prompt 7 fully realized. 500 words, Kitako style, slow closure and grounded warmth. Weeks passed quietly. The rain returned and left again, sidewalks glistening in the mornings. I found myself at the corner cafe one Thursday, the one with the mismatched chairs and faint smell of burnt espresso. She was already there, seated at the small table near the window, chai latte in hand, fingers wrapped around the mug like it grounded her. I smiled at her, and she smiled back, not the big, dramatic kind, just the subtle one that said, I see you, and I'm glad you're here. I joined her, ordered my black coffee, and we settled into a rhythm that felt ordinary, and that's what made it extraordinary. We shared glances over steaming mugs, not always speaking, letting the silence do the work. Some mornings it was words, sometimes just tea, sometimes the quiet click of spoon against porcelain. She laughed at something small I said, flicked her eyes toward my hands, and I realized how familiar it felt to notice these tiny gestures again. One afternoon, we walked to the park bench near the fountain, the same one we had avoided for a week when things felt fragile. It was empty, quiet. We sat side by side, shoulders just barely brushing, comfortable now with a nearness we had feared before. I traced the edge of the bench with my fingers, remembering how it had once held tension, hesitation, almost confessions. Now, it held warmth, familiarity, a steady pulse of us existing quietly together. She reached for her cup, hand brushing mine just slightly. We laughed softly at the accidental touch, and I realized this. These small, stolen moments were enough. Enough to make the apartment feel warmer, the streets softer, the mornings brighter. Sometimes we lingered over tea at 8:47 a.m., her cinnamon chai next to my black coffee, watching strangers pass by without noticing the quiet gravity of our little corner of the world. Sometimes we sat in silence, the clock ticking, the world moving on, and I felt a peace I hadn't known was possible. Not perfect, not scripted, just real. She told me about a memory from years ago, something small and funny, and I realized I could imagine a future with her in it. Not a grand declaration, not a storybook ending, just a series of mornings, coffees, bench visits, small touches, and shared silence. That was enough. As we walked back from the cafe, one evening, the sky pale and the air damp from an earlier drizzle, I thought about how far we'd come. The uncertainty, the pause, the almost confessions, they had all led here. I glanced at her as she caught my eyes, a soft, knowing smile on her lips. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. She understood. Later, alone with my mug of black coffee, I remembered how it had started. Half-finished shows, unsent texts, awkward glances, and a knock at my door. And I realized that the quietest moments, the small, ordinary choices, the willingness to stay, the subtle gestures, had changed everything. I smiled softly to myself, thinking this is ours. Just ours. And somewhere between the steam of the coffee and the quiet hum of the apartment, I knew we had arrived. Not with fireworks, not with a proclamation, just with a gentle, steady existence that felt like home.